I thought it was just a doll, an old and dusty object that I found by chance in that antique shop. But then the sound started. At first, faint noises around the house, then the crying. My doll won't stop crying. No matter what I do, no matter where I put her, I always hear that desperate wailing echoing through the night. Now, things are getting worse. Movements in the shadows, whispering voices, secrets no one should know. Something is trapped here with me, and I feel like time is running out. The light rain trickled down the car windshield as I aimlessly drove through the suburbs. I didn't want to return to the empty apartment. It had become a darker and more oppressive place since the divorce. That day, the gray streets perfectly reflected how I felt inside. I parked the car when I saw an antique shop I had never noticed before. Small and discreet, nestled between old buildings, it seemed to have stood the test of time. A faded sign read "Antiques and Curiosities" since 1923. I entered, pushing the heavy wooden door that creaked loudly in the silent shop. The smell of mold and old wood filled my nose. The interior was filled with objects from another era, worn furniture, pendulum clocks, yellowed paintings, and display cases full of old knickknacks. There was something comforting about that place, as if I had been transported to another time. As I walked among the shelves, my eyes were drawn to a doll. She sat alone on a high shelf, a little apart from the other items. Her blue glass eyes stared at me in a way I couldn't explain. Her white lace dress was yellowed with age, and her curly blonde hair looked disheveled. There was something about her, a deep melancholy, that made me stop and stare at her for a few moments. "Beautiful, isn't she?" A deep voice sounded behind me. I jumped, my heart racing. I turned to see an elderly man with a deeply wrinkled face standing next to me. He wore a thick wool sweater, and his gaze looked tired. "She is," I replied uncertainly. "How much?" The old man frowned, as if he wasn't expecting the question. He looked at the doll for a few seconds before answering. "That doll has a story," he began, but his voice faltered. It was as if he was trying to choose his words carefully. "I like her," I interrupted, perhaps more firmly than I intended. I didn't know why, but I felt a sudden need to take her with me. He sighed, resigned, and mumbled a price much lower than I had expected for a piece like that. I was surprised but paid quickly before he could change his mind. "Be careful with her, miss," he said as he wrapped the doll in thick paper. "Sometimes, old things carry more than just memories." I nodded, not giving much thought to the warning. It was just a doll, after all. I took the doll and left the shop with a strange feeling in my chest. Part of me wanted to go back and leave her where I found her, but something stronger urged me to take her with me. When I got home, the silence of the apartment hit me like a cold wave. I closed the door behind me and, for a moment, stood in the hallway, staring at the doll wrapped in my arms. I placed her on the living room table, unfolded the paper around her, and left her there, sitting with her small body upright and her glassy eyes fixed on me. I still felt that discomfort, a feeling hard to explain. Maybe it was just the weight of the last few months, the divorce, the loneliness. I was seeing things that weren't there. "It's just a doll," I whispered to myself, as if I needed to reinforce that idea. I took a hot shower, made a cup of tea, and tried to distract my mind with a book, but my eyes kept drifting toward the doll. She hadn't moved, obviously, but the feeling of being watched persisted. A little irritated with myself, I finally decided to take her to the guest room, a place I hardly used. It was easier that way, out of sight, out of mind. I carefully placed her on the bed, adjusted her dress, and left, closing the door behind me. That night, I tried to watch a movie in the living room, but my thoughts kept returning to the doll. Around midnight, I went to bed. The apartment was immersed in silence, except for the occasional sound of the wind against the windows. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't long before I was awakened by a faint sound. something that, at first, I thought was part of my dream. I opened my eyes slowly, my heart beating faster than usual. There was a muffled sound coming from the other side of the apartment. I got up, confused, and looked around. At first, I thought it was just the natural creaking of the house, the old wood groaning in the wind. Maybe. But the sound continued. It was a soft noise, like something was dragging. I walked slowly down the hallway and listened more closely. It was coming from the guest room. I took a deep breath and, with hesitant steps, approached the closed door. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. The light from the hallway flooded into the dark room, and my eyes went straight to the bed. The doll was no longer sitting there. She was on the floor, lying on her side, her face turned toward me. The shock was immediate, but I tried to calm myself. "She just fell," I murmured, as if saying it out loud would be enough to dispel the strange fear growing inside me. I carefully picked up the doll and placed her back on the bed. Her eyes, now even brighter in the reflection of the dim light, seemed to follow me as I moved. I closed the door again and went back to my room, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. But as I lay in bed, the discomfort intensified. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, I knew something was wrong with that doll. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, like a muffled sob. Still half asleep, I turned over in bed, trying to ignore it. Maybe it was some noise from outside, a child crying or the wind whistling through the window cracks. But the sound didn't stop. It was a cry, soft and continuous, spreading through the silence of the apartment. Something more personal, intimate. It took my mind a few seconds to realize where it was coming from, and then a chill ran down my spine. The sound wasn't coming from outside, nor from the neighbor's apartment. It was coming from inside my own apartment. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound was coming from the guest room, the room where I had left the doll. The air became heavy, as if something invisible was pressing on my chest. I knew I needed to get up, to investigate, but part of me begged to ignore it, to hide under the covers like a frightened child. But the crying, it was unbearable, a mournful wail, each sob filled with pain, so real that it seemed impossible to ignore. With trembling legs, I got out of bed and headed down the hallway. The apartment was plunged into darkness, except for the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence. The crying continued, now clearer, closer, and it was definitely coming from the guest room. I stopped in front of the door. The sound was louder here, as if it was right on the other side of the wood. I touched the doorknob with hesitant fingers and felt the coldness spreading through it. Part of me wanted to run back to my room, lock the door, and try to pretend nothing was happening. But before I could rationalize my fear, I turned the knob and opened the door. The room was dark, except for a sliver of streetlight coming through the window. My eyes took a moment to adjust, and then I saw her. The doll was still on the bed, exactly where I had left her. But the sound, the persistent crying, was coming from her. Hannah. The name inscribed in small letters on the bottom of her brown leather shoe came to mind. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The crying grew clearer as I got closer, and it seemed impossible. How could a doll make that sound? My first thought was that there must be some kind of device inside her. Maybe she was one of those old dolls with a sound mechanism or some cheap trick from the antique shop. But something about the tone of that cry, something seemed alive, pulsing with sorrow. I touched the doll with trembling fingers. Her surface was cold and rigid. I turned her upside down, looking for some compartment, some hidden switch or battery that would explain the sound. But all I saw were old seams and worn wooden joints. Nothing electronic, nothing that made sense. I lifted the doll by her arms, turning her in my hands. The crying stopped abruptly, as if it had been cut off mid-sob. My heart raced, and for a moment, silence returned to the room. I stood there, holding the doll, trying to understand what had just happened. But before I could act again, the crying started again, even louder, echoing through the walls like a cry of pure despair. I dropped the doll to the floor. The sound reverberated through the wood, but the crying didn't stop. It was as if the wailing was coming from inside her, something I couldn't see, something that shouldn't be there. My eyes widened as I took steps back, the fear rising in my throat like a trapped scream. And then, in the middle of that despair, a thought hit me like a punch. It wasn't mechanical. The doll couldn't make that sound. There were no batteries, no hidden compartments. Nothing. I ran to the door, slamming it behind me. The crying still echoed behind me, muffled by the wood, but present, insistent, as if begging for something. I leaned my forehead against the door, panting, trying to rationalize what had just happened. For a few minutes, the sound continued. I stayed there, motionless, my fingers gripping the wood of the door, my heart pounding frantically. And then, as suddenly as it began, the crying stopped. Silence reigned in the apartment again, but the relief I had hoped for never came. Only a somber feeling, a horrible premonition, settled over me. I knew that night wouldn't be the last time I heard that crying. Something was deeply wrong with that doll, and I needed to find out what. The night had barely ended when the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch, my mind trapped in the strangeness of that night, the crying, that damn crying that still echoed in my head. I needed answers. Without wasting more time, I put on a coat and left the house, heading straight for the antique shop. The morning wind was cold, biting, and the streets seemed strangely empty, as if the world was suspended. Every step brought back that uneasy feeling I had when I first laid eyes on the doll. Something was wrong, and the answer was in Hannah's past. I was sure of it. When I arrived at the shop, the door was already open, and the little bell above it jingled with a sad sound as I entered. The old shopkeeper was behind the counter, as if he had been waiting for me. His tired eyes met mine, and he sighed heavily when he saw me enter. "I knew you would come back," he murmured in a defeated tone. I stopped in front of the counter, trying not to appear scared, but something in his expression made me feel even more uneasy. "I need to know the truth about the doll," I said bluntly. "Last night, she was crying, and it wasn't just that. There's no way she's just a normal doll. Something is very wrong with her." The old man held my gaze for a few seconds, as if deciding whether or not to tell me what he knew. Finally, he looked down, scratching his thin beard, and began to speak in a low tone, as if confessing something he had tried to forget. "That doll, Hannah, that's her name. She belonged to a girl many years ago. A little girl named, well, Hannah, of course." He paused, his eyes lost in a distant memory. "Hannah was a sweet child from a wealthy family. The doll was made especially for her, a one-of-a-kind piece. But something happened." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue, feeling my stomach churn with growing tension. "She died, didn't she?" I whispered, somehow already knowing the answer. He nodded, his face somber. "Yes, she died tragically, under strange circumstances. No one talks about it much these days, but I remember the story. Hannah drowned in the small pond behind the family house. The details were never clear. Some say it was an accident, others that it was something worse." "What do you mean by something worse?" I asked, my heart tightening in my chest. He gave me an intense look, as if trying to decide whether to continue. He took a deep breath before going on. "Some say the doll was with her that day, that the girl was strangely attached to the doll. She always talked to her, as if she were a real person. Some of the house staff said they heard the doll respond. Whispers, giggles, the kind of things children do, you know. But, well, after Hannah died, no one wanted to keep the doll. It was considered a bad omen. The family sold it, and since then, it has passed from hand to hand, and none of them found peace. A cold wave ran down my spine. The shopkeeper seemed sincere, and every word he said only increased my unease. But there was still something I couldn't understand. If you knew all this, why did you sell me the doll? I asked, trying not to sound accusatory, but it was hard to contain my frustration. He rubbed his face with his hands, visibly uncomfortable with the question. I try not to sell it, but you seemed so determined. And maybe, just maybe, I was hoping that somehow the curse would finally end. I thought that maybe if she found someone who could understand. He let the sentence hang, as if unsure how to finish. I stood there, trying to process it all. A curse? A spirit trapped in a doll? I wanted to believe it was all just old superstition, a story told to scare, but after what I had experienced the night before, I didn't know what to think anymore. What do I do now? I asked, my voice a bit louder than expected. The fear was starting to take over me. The old man sighed, his shoulders slumping even more, as if he carried the weight of decades of dark secrets. If I were you, I'd get rid of her. The longer she stays with you, the stronger she'll get. These things don't have an easy end. I should have agreed. I should have left there, gone back home, and gotten rid of the doll as quickly as possible. But instead, I felt something different. It wasn't just fear or dread. It was curiosity, an insatiable need to understand what was happening, to find out why Hannah was connected to that doll, and why her spirit, if that's what it was still trapped. I looked at the shopkeeper, his warning expression etched on his face, and gave a brief nod, pretending I would consider his advice. "Thank you for telling me," I said quickly before leaving the shop. Outside, the wind felt even colder, biting my face as I walked to the car. I knew I was making the wrong decision, but something pushed me to move forward. Something told me that somehow I needed to go back home with the doll. Maybe it was Hannah, or whatever presence was in the doll, pulling me back. As I drove back to the apartment, I could only think of one thing. Hannah's story wasn't over. And now, somehow, I was part of it. As soon as I entered the apartment, the atmosphere seemed to change. The space, which had once been just empty and silent, was now filled with an invisible tension, as if something was lurking, waiting. I placed the keys on the table and closed the door behind me. For a few seconds, I stood still, listening to the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the small space. The doll, still sitting on the bed in the guest room, was waiting for me. That unsettling feeling of being watched returned, a strange weight that seemed to press on my chest. I knew I should get rid of her, but something, maybe my own morbid curiosity, kept me from doing so. That doll, that spirit, seemed connected to me in a way I couldn't explain. As I walked down the hallway toward the living room, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. I stopped, my heart racing, but when I looked again, nothing was out of place. Just the silence, heavy with anticipation. I tried to distract myself. I made a cup of coffee, turned on the TV, and threw myself onto the couch in a desperate attempt to pretend my life was normal. But every time silence fell, I felt that presence. Hannah, or whatever it was no longer confined to the room. It was as if she were everywhere, spread across the dark corners of the apartment, watching my every move. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then it happened again. "Mommy?" The word was soft, almost a faint whisper, coming from somewhere inside the apartment. I swallowed hard, my whole body freezing. I looked around, my gaze wandering over the furniture and shadows, as if I expected something to appear out of nowhere. "Mom?" This time, it was louder, clearer. My mind refused to believe what I was hearing, but my whole body was tense, fear tearing at my reason. I knew the doll was in the guest room, so how could I be hearing that voice here in the living room? I stood up slowly, my legs trembling, and started walking down the hallway. The apartment seemed darker than before, the shadows stretched out like reaching hands. When I reached the guest room door, I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound didn't repeat, but I knew what I had heard. It wasn't my imagination. With a quick movement, I opened the door. The doll was there, sitting on the bed, her cold glass eyes fixed on me, as if she knew I had come because of her. "Help me." The word came out slowly, as if it had been forced through lips that didn't exist. The sound, though low, filled the room like a sinister echo, vibrating in the air. My knees almost gave way, but I forced myself to take a step forward. "What do you want?" I whispered, not knowing why I was speaking to her, not knowing what I expected to hear. The doll remained motionless, her face blank, expressionless, but the air around her felt denser, heavier. It was as if all the energy in the room was being drawn to that single point where she sat. I knelt down, approaching cautiously, waiting for a sign, something to tell me that this wasn't real. I took the doll in my hands, turning her over, trying to find some device again, some hidden trick. There was nothing, just the rigid wooden and porcelain structure. Suddenly, the doll moved. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to freeze my blood. I dropped her immediately, her body leaning forward and slowly falling to the floor, as if surrendering to her own weight. "Help me." The voice sounded again, this time more pleading. I tried to step back, but my back hit the wall. I felt trapped there, not knowing what to do. Was I going crazy? Was that it? Was I projecting my own fears and pains onto that doll? I forced myself to take a deep breath, to calm my thoughts. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe my divorce and loneliness were finally affecting me in a deeper way, making me imagine things. I decided I needed a break. I left the doll lying on the floor and walked out of the room, slamming the door shut. I needed to do something to get it out of my head, to distract my mind. I returned to the living room and threw myself back on the couch, trying to focus on anything other than that room. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I could feel the doll's eyes on me, even with the door closed, as if she were everywhere. I grabbed the remote and turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown out the silence. But no matter what I did, that feeling persisted. Hannah's presence was like a shadow hanging over me, dense, suffocating. That's when I heard the sound, a slow, soft dragging coming from the hallway. I froze, the remote slipping from my hands. I looked at the hallway, feeling my whole body tense with fear. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to see what was happening, but my eyes, almost against my will, fixed on the shadows enveloping the entrance to the guest room. There she was, the doll, in the middle of the hallway. I knew I had left her in the room, lying on the floor, but now she was there, sitting, motionless, as if she had been carefully positioned. Her glass eyes were fixed directly on me, and in that instant, the cold chill down my spine was more intense than anything I had ever experienced. She had moved, by herself, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she wanted something from me. Something I wasn't ready to give. I woke up in the middle of the night with a heavy, suffocating feeling, as if something was watching me. My body was paralyzed with confusion, my chest tight, and my breathing shallow. For a moment, I thought it was just a lingering nightmare, but when I opened my eyes, I realized I wasn't alone. There, sitting at the edge of the bed, was the doll. My eyes could hardly believe what they were seeing. Hannah's small porcelain body was perfectly balanced on the edge of the mattress, her legs dangling off the side of the bed, as if she had been placed there carefully. But I knew it wasn't me. And then I noticed something even more disturbing. There were tears streaming down her face. Small rivulets of water ran down her porcelain cheeks, dripping onto her dress, leaving dark stains. My mind refused to accept it. Dolls don't cry. They don't move on their own. And they definitely don't appear at the edge of your bed in the middle of the night with tears in their eyes. But there she was, staring at me with those cold, expressionless glass eyes, as if trying to tell me something, as if demanding my attention. My body reacted before my mind could process. I jumped out of bed, throwing the blanket aside so forcefully that it fell to the floor. I quickly grabbed the doll, feeling the cold of her porcelain against my trembling fingers, and left the room. I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. The apartment seemed to breathe with me, its shadows lengthening and shifting as I moved, as if they were following me. When I reached the guest room, I threw the door open and tossed the doll back onto the bed. Her body fell sideways, her arms and legs twisting in strange directions, but I didn't care. I slammed the door shut, panting, and stood there for a few seconds, my forehead resting against the cold wood. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of the beats filling my mind. Was I going crazy? Had that really happened? I returned to bed, but sleep seemed impossible now. The image of the crying doll, sitting there so close to me, kept spinning in my head. The apartment, once a silent refuge, now felt like a living, pulsating place where silence hid secrets I didn't want to uncover. In the following nights, things started to get even stranger. The doll, which I made sure to leave in the guest room, kept appearing in different places around the house. At first, they were discreet spots, on a chair in the living room, on the floor, in the hallway. But over time, the appearances became more intense. I remember one morning in particular. I had gone out early to buy groceries, trying to distract myself from the spiraling anxiety that built up each night. When I returned, as soon as I opened the door, I saw the doll sitting on the living room couch. She was perfectly placed, her hands delicately resting on her lap, as if someone had arranged her. The shock made me drop the bags, scattering cans and food packages across the entryway. I hadn't left Hannah there. I was sure of that. She had been in the guest room, with the door closed, the last time I saw her. I grabbed the doll and, once again, took her back to the guest room. I placed her on the bed, more carefully this time, and closed the door firmly. But the feeling that something was wrong in the apartment followed me with every step. That same night, while I was preparing dinner, I heard a soft sound behind me. It was a familiar sound, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of fabric against wood. I turned slowly, the knife still in my hand, and felt my heart stop for a second. The doll was sitting at the kitchen table. Her legs dangled from the chair, and her glass eyes stared straight at me, as if she were waiting. And this time, I hadn't even left the kitchen. There was no way someone had moved her without me noticing. I dropped the knife into the sink, the loud clatter echoing through the kitchen, and stared at the doll for a few seconds, trying to gather the courage to pick her up once again. This can't be, I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself that it was just stress, tension, anything that could be rationally explained. But things only got worse. I started noticing small objects disappearing. My wedding ring, which I had stored at the bottom of a drawer, simply vanished. Some clothes, a book I used to keep on the nightstand, all disappearing mysteriously without me remembering moving them. One night, while looking for the remote, which seemed to have disappeared, I found it in a place that took my breath away, next to the doll, in the guest room, as if it had been placed there on purpose. I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. Maybe the shopkeeper had been right. Maybe I should get rid of the doll. But every time I tried to make a decision, something held me back. Something told me that Hannah wasn't just going to disappear. Deep down, I knew things were spiraling out of control, but it was too late to turn back. With each passing day, I felt more connected to the doll, as if she were binding me to something I still didn't understand. And now, more than ever, I was sure she wasn't going away easily. On the first night, the nightmare started so subtly that for a moment, it felt like just a distorted memory. I was back in the antique shop, the shelves crammed with old and forgotten objects. The light inside the shop was dimmer than I remembered, and the air smelled sweet but rotten, like dead flowers. In the back, I saw the doll, Hannah, on her usual shelf, her glass eyes fixed on me. But this time, something was different. She wasn't alone. Next to the doll, a girl slowly appeared, as if materializing from the shadows. Her hair was wet, hanging in drenched strands over her pale face, and her clothes, a white dress, were heavy with water dripping onto the wooden floor. It was Hannah, the girl, her face covered in tears and her eyes full of pain. She began to approach, and I couldn't move. My legs were stuck to the floor, and fear consumed me. Her mouth opened, but instead of words, all I heard was a wail, a heart-wrenching sob that echoed through the empty shop. The sound made me shudder, because it wasn't just any cry. It was the same cry I had heard before, the same one that came from the doll. "Please help me." Her voice finally came out, low and desperate, the words broken by her incessant sobbing. She reached out toward me, but before I could touch her, I woke with a start, my body covered in cold sweat. The darkness of my room felt less welcoming than ever. My racing heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I couldn't distinguish reality from the dream. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the bed, watching the shadows that seemed to move along the walls. The doll was still in the guest room, but now it seemed like she was everywhere, even without me seeing her. The feeling that she was watching me, that she was waiting, wouldn't leave my mind. In the days that followed, the nightmares continued, each one more vivid, each one more real. Every time I closed my eyes, there was Hannah, the girl, with her pale face and tear-filled eyes, pleading, begging for something I couldn't understand. In the dreams, she always repeated the same words. "Help me, free me." The desperation in her voice ate away at me, but at the same time, something about her scared me. It wasn't just the pain she carried. It was a sense that, behind the sadness, there was something much darker, something I couldn't, or didn't want to understand. As time passed, the nightmares began to blend with reality. I would hear her voice during the day, always whispering the same phrases. At first, it was just vague noises that I tried to ignore. But soon, her voice became clearer, as if Hannah were standing right next to me. "Help me." The first time I heard it clearly was in the kitchen. I was washing the dishes, trying to focus on anything that would distract me, when I heard the whisper coming from behind me. My body froze. I dropped the plate I was holding, and it slipped from my hand and clattered loudly into the sink. I turned slowly, my heart racing. No one was there, just emptiness. The house was silent, except for the soft sound of the wind against the windows. But I knew what I had heard, Hannah's voice. Suddenly, the apartment felt more suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me. The air was heavy, almost tangible, and heat rose on my skin. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The lack of sleep was affecting me. That had to be it. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the hallucinations became. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake to the sound of children's laughter echoing through the dark hallways of the apartment. Other times, I would see Hannah out of the corner of my eye, her silhouette appearing in the corners of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned my head. With each new day, I became more desperate to avoid sleep. Staying awake seemed like the only solution, but the exhaustion, the mental strain, was starting to take its toll. I wandered through the house like a ghost, feeling my sanity slipping through my fingers. I started avoiding mirrors, not because I feared seeing something behind me, but because I feared what I was becoming. My eyes were sunken, my skin pale and marked with deep dark circles. With every passing day, I felt more distant from reality. It was on one of those nights, as I struggled to stay awake, that things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting on the couch, my body exhausted, but my mind too restless to rest. The silence of the apartment was suffocating. All I could hear was my own breathing until something moved. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Light footsteps, as if someone were walking barefoot on the wooden floor. I felt my body freeze, every fiber of me reacting to the fear. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see if I did, but it was as if something forced me to turn my head. And there she was, Hannah, not the doll but the girl from my nightmares. She was standing in the hallway, partially wrapped in shadows, her face barely illuminated by the dim light of the living room. Were red and swollen, silent tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She was staring at me, as if waiting for an answer. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice so soft I could barely hear it. I tried to speak, but the words were stuck in my throat. All I could do was shake my head slowly, unable to understand what she wanted from me. Suddenly, her feet began to move toward me, dragging softly across the floor. It was as if she were floating, making no effort to walk. And when she was close enough, I stopped breathing. Hannah reached out her hand toward me. Her fingers, wet and pale, stopped just inches from my face, and then her mouth opened again. "Free me, please." Panic hit me like a wave, and without thinking, I jumped off the couch, running through the apartment like a desperate prey. I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to run. The sound of her footsteps still echoed in my head, like a constant reminder that, wherever I went, Hannah would be there. And deep down, I knew she wouldn't stop until I did what she asked. But what did she really want? And more importantly, would I survive long enough to find out? After weeks of being tormented by nightmares and hallucinations, I finally made a decision. It was time to find out the truth about Hannah. Those words, "Help me and free me," echoed in my mind day and night. The doll, the nightmares, Hannah's very presence in my life. It all seemed to have an origin that I still couldn't comprehend. With my mind exhausted and my body weakened by lack of sleep, I hit the road toward Hannah's hometown. The antique shop owner had mentioned a small town nearby where she had grown up and where her tragedy had unfolded. It was a town that, he said, preferred to forget its secrets. Driving through the deserted roads gave me a deep sense of isolation, as if I were crossing an invisible line between reality and something much darker. I arrived in town late in the afternoon. The streets were small, lined with old wooden houses and a church in the distance, its imposing bell tower standing like a sentinel over the place. It was one of those villages forgotten by time, where dust seemed to collect in the corners and history hung in the air like an invisible weight. The few people who passed by cast furtive glances, but no one seemed willing to talk. It was as if everyone knew something I didn't, a secret they preferred to keep buried. My first stop was the small town archives. The building was as old as the town, with worn walls and the smell of old paper lingering in the air. An elderly woman with thick glasses and a curious expression greeted me at the counter. "I'm looking for information about a girl named Hannah. She died many years ago." I began, trying to stay calm. "Do you have any records of her family?" The woman gave me a curious look, and for a moment, I thought she would refuse to help. But instead, she sighed and slowly got up, disappearing into the depths of the filing shelves. The name Hannah isn't very common around here, especially related to a death, she said, rummaging through the old files with her aged fingers. I think I know what you're talking about. A few minutes later, she returned with a dusty file. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but as I opened them, I saw the name Hannah Whitmore written in elegant script, as if engraved in the memory of the paper. The photos from the time were faded, showing a smiling girl with curly blonde hair, which didn't match the haunted figure from my nightmares. She died young, the woman said, with a tone of sadness that seemed to share the burden of that story. The Whitmore family was one of the wealthiest in town, you know. They had land, servants, and were very private. Hannah's death shook everyone, especially because it was so strange. Strange how? I asked, leaning over the counter, my heart racing with the weight of the impending discovery. She looked at me over her glasses, as if deciding whether to tell me the rest. They say she drowned in the pond behind the family estate, but some believe her death wasn't an accident. Some people talk about screams in the night, strange lights in the house. After she died, her father disappeared, vanished from town, without a trace. My thoughts swirled around that information. Hannah's father disappearing right after her death, and the doll. Something about that story was pulling me deeper, drawing me toward a truth I still couldn't reach. And the doll? I asked, feeling my throat tighten. Do you know anything about a doll that belonged to Hannah? The woman frowned, looking uncomfortable. Yes, the doll was a gift from her father shortly before everything happened. He had it made by a local craftsman, a unique piece. After Hannah died, the doll disappeared along with her father. Some people say he took it with him, others. Well, some believe the doll carries a part of Hannah with it, as if the girl's soul had somehow become trapped inside. Those words hit me like a stab. Everything was starting to make sense, or at least the little sense this madness could have. The doll, Hannah's spirit, the pleas for help. Her father, with his mysterious disappearance, seemed to be at the center of it all. Before leaving the archives, I asked the woman one more question, my voice hesitant. The Whitmore house, does it still exist? Yes, the woman replied, but no one's lived there for years. It's at the edge of town, near the pond. People don't like going near it. They say it's cursed. I thanked the woman and quickly left, my heart still pounding in my chest. Now I knew my next step. If Hannah's soul was trapped in the doll, maybe the key to freeing her was in the house where it all began. I drove to the edge of town, where the asphalt gave way to a narrow dirt road, flanked by old trees. The silence was deep there, as if the world itself had forgotten about this place. The Whitmore house soon appeared before me, an old and decrepit mansion, its windows covered in dust and the dark wood worn by time. In the distance, I caught a glimpse of the pond. The waters were dark and still, like a grim mirror reflecting the gray sky above. I hesitated before getting out of the car. The weight of the discovery was crushing me, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. I crossed the rusted gate and walked up to the front door, which was slightly ajar, as if waiting for my arrival. Inside the house, the air was heavy and smelled of mold. Shadows seemed to dance on the walls, shifting with the faint light filtering through the windows. Every step echoed on the wooden floor, making the space feel even more empty and lonely. I climbed the stairs, my mind filled with questions. Where was Hannah's father? And more importantly, what had he done to trap her spirit in the doll? I reached a room at the end of the hallway. When I opened the door, I saw something that made me stop. In the center of the room, on a small wooden bed, was another doll, an almost exact replica of Hannah, except for one thing. Her eyes were completely black, empty, like a bottomless void. This was where it all began. And this was where I would uncover the truth about what really happened to Hannah and her father. Suddenly, the doll I had brought with me, the real Hannah, began to make a faint sound. It was a whisper, as if something inside her was struggling to get out. I knew then that I was closer to the truth than I had ever been. But the truth, like a lurking shadow, was about to reveal itself, and I had no idea what I was about to face. The silence in the Whitmore house was thick, heavy, as if the very air was conspiring against me. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I approached the center of the room, where the two dolls were. Hannah's replica, with her black, empty eyes, seemed to be watching the Real doll I had brought with me, as if they shared an ancient and horrible secret. The whisper coming from inside the doll in my hands was growing louder, and I knew I could no longer ignore it. My first instinct was to get rid of it. Maybe if I burned the doll, if I freed her in the simplest and most final way, it would all end. Hannah, or whatever she was, would stop haunting me. I grabbed the doll with trembling hands, the cold, rigid porcelain against my skin, and began to hurry down the stairs. Each step felt longer than the last, as if time itself were stretching, trying to keep me from reaching my destination. I found the fireplace in the living room. The old, broken wood still held remnants of ancient ashes. With a sense of urgency, I knelt on the floor, struck a match, and watched as the small flames rose, trembling and fragile. As the fire began to grow stronger, I gripped the doll more tightly. But just as I prepared to throw her into the fire, something stopped me. My hand froze in the air, as if held by an invisible force. I tried to let go of the doll, but my fingers were locked, my muscles tense, unable to move. The sense of control I thought I had was slipping away, replaced by a growing, absolute fear. The air around me turned icy, and an invisible pressure seemed to squeeze my chest, making it hard to even breathe. That's when the doll spoke. "You can't burn me." The voice was soft, but filled with something inhuman, something ancient. The sound reverberated in my head like a distant echo, but clear. "I need you, Sarah." Hannah's voice was no longer the fragile wail of a scared little girl. Now, it sounded different, stronger, almost authoritative. It was as if Hannah's true nature was finally revealing itself. "You don't know what you're doing?" The doll continued, her voice growing sharper. "I'm not just a spirit, Sarah. There's something much bigger involved. Something your simple fear cannot comprehend." My fingers tightened around the porcelain as despair mingled with fear. The fire crackled before me, but the thought of destroying the doll now seemed impossible. Something within me, a force that wasn't mine, prevented me from acting. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How can I free you?" For a moment, silence reigned. And then, the doll began to tell a story. A story no one else could know. "Do you remember that time, when you were a child?" The voice whispered, but it was no longer a distant sound. It was inside me. "When your father left you alone in the park, and you cried until you fell asleep between the swings. No one came to help. No one showed up. You stayed there in the cold, waiting." The blood froze in my veins. It was impossible for her to know that. I had never told anyone about that day. It was such a painful memory that I had buried it deeply, believing it would never resurface. But Hannah knew. Somehow she knew. "Who are you?" I screamed, panic overflowing. "I am Hannah, yes, but I am also more. Much more." The doll was still in my hands, but the feeling that she would move at any moment terrified me. "I am trapped here. Not just in this doll's body, but in something much darker. My father, he tried to save me, but he failed. And now, the only way to free me is through you." "Free you? How?" I kept asking, growing more desperate, the words almost choking in my throat. Hannah didn't respond immediately. The silence was unbearable. All I could hear was the crackling of the flames and the sound of my own irregular breathing. Then, the doll spoke again, but this time her voice was intertwined with something deeper, a shadow behind the words. My father knew something you don't yet understand. He didn't disappear out of cowardice. He tried to do what was necessary. But he failed because he didn't have the courage to complete the ritual. Ritual? The word made my body freeze. The Whitmore house, the doll, Hannah's death, it all seemed part of something bigger, something far more terrifying than I had imagined. That second doll in the room, with eyes as black as a bottomless abyss, kept haunting my thoughts. Hannah's father hadn't simply disappeared. He had become part of an unfinished ritual, a malevolent cycle. What did your father do? I asked, hesitantly, already anticipating that the answer would be much worse than I could bear. He tried to bring me back. Hannah's voice was fragile for a moment, almost like the girl I had seen in my dreams. But he brought something else, something that clung to me and trapped me here. In the doll. In the house. And now, I am in you too. My heart raced. Now, I am in you too. The words echoed like a sentence. I wasn't just being haunted by Hannah. She was somehow fused with me. Maybe from the moment I touched the doll in the antique shop, or since I brought her home. Every interaction, every night I heard her crying, every appearance was part of a larger process, a dark bond that now entangled me. The second doll. I began trying to control the fear tightening my throat. What does it have to do with all of this? She is the other part of me, Hannah replied, with a calmness that made me shiver. My father tried to divide my soul to prevent the darkness from consuming me completely. He believed that if he could separate the good and the bad, he could save me, but he failed. And now, the darkest part of me is trapped in the second doll. That abyss you saw in her eyes is the void where my soul is imprisoned. The ground seemed to vanish beneath me. I was dealing not with the spirit of an innocent girl, but with something corrupted, a malevolence that had seeped into everything around me. Hannah's father, in his attempt to save his daughter, had created a monster, a cycle that was now repeating through me. The fire roared before me, but the thought of destroying the doll now seemed impossible. I needed to understand more, learn more, because somehow the answer to freeing Hannah and myself was here, within that house, hidden in the dark secrets of the Whitmore family. But first, I needed help from a paranormal expert. Returning to the old Whitmore house another day felt even more menacing in the night's darkness. The moon, obscured by thick clouds, cast long and distorted shadows over the surrounding land. Thomas Avery, the paranormal investigator I had called, stood beside me. He moved slowly, his gaze scanning every detail of the house with a serious expression. Since the last time I had been there, the air felt even heavier, as if the house were alive with secrets from the past, waiting for someone to unearth them. As we approached the entrance, I once again felt Hannah's presence. Since she had revealed her father's failure to save her soul, the feeling of being watched had never left me. I could feel her eyes, not just from the doll, but from something much deeper, much older, watching me from the shadows. Something trapped in the house as much as she was. This is it, Thomas said, stopping in front of the old, worn wooden door. He looked at me seriously. This house is where it all started. If there are answers, they are inside. I nodded, trying to steady the tremble in my hands. I knew what we were about to find wouldn't be easy to face. But after everything I had been through, the nightmares, the hallucinations, Hannah's uncontrollable presence, I had no choice. This had to end. Thomas pushed the door open with a loud creak. The smell of mold and rotting would hit us immediately. We stepped inside, and the darkness swallowed us. The shadows seemed denser, more oppressive, as if they hid something alive. Thomas turned on a flashlight, illuminating the narrow corridors leading to the house's abandoned rooms. "Where did you speak with her last time?" he asked, his voice low. "In the living room," I replied. "In front of the fireplace. That's where Hannah told me about the ritual and how her father failed." Thomas nodded and made his way to the main living room. When we entered, the atmosphere felt more suffocating than I remembered. The fireplace was still there, dark and cold, like an open mouth waiting to devour anything that approached. The circle of symbols drawn on the floor, where Hannah had told me her father tried to split her soul, was still visible, faded but present. This was where it all began, and this was where it would end. Thomas began unpacking his equipment. He opened an ancient book, as old as the house itself, filled with symbols I couldn't identify. Then he pulled out an audio recorder and some crystals, positioning them strategically around the room. "This place is full of residual energy," he said as he lit some candles and placed them in the corners of the room. "The ritual Hannah's father tried to perform left a deep mark here, and the entity he released along with her." He paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "It's still trapped. Part of it is in the doll you have, but another part is here in the house, in the second doll." My eyes instinctively turned to the doll we had found in the room, the one with the black, empty eyes. It was still in the house, a constant presence, silent but terrifying. It was the dark part of Hannah, the part her father tried to isolate but had instead created something far worse. The ritual he tried wasn't just to save Hannah, Thomas continued, now flipping through the book in front of him. It was to split her soul into two parts, good and evil, light and dark. But by doing that, he opened a portal, a passage, for something much more dangerous. Something that is now trapped here, divided between the two dolls. As Thomas spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air in the room seemed to vibrate slightly, as if we were being watched, judged. The tension grew with each passing second. "So, how do we fix this?" I asked, trying to control the growing fear inside me. Thomas stood up, closing the book with a snap. "There's a way. We can recreate the ritual, but this time, we have to do it correctly. The problem is that it requires a sacrifice. We don't know exactly what her father couldn't complete, but the original ritual failed because he didn't have the courage to finish it." "What kind of sacrifice?" My voice was barely a whisper, but I already had a terrible idea of what he was talking about. Thomas looked at me with sharp seriousness. "A life sacrifice. An exchange of energy. The soul that's trapped here needs to be released, but for that to happen, another must take its place, or the cycle will repeat." My mind whirled. If Hannah's father couldn't do it, it was because he wasn't willing to sacrifice his own daughter, or maybe even himself. Now, I was faced with the same choice. Hannah wanted to be freed, but what did that mean? What if it was a trap? "We have to act quickly," Thomas said, interrupting my thoughts. "The presence of a second doll is growing. If we don't do this now, she will break free and take full control of Hannah. And if that happens, you'll be the next to be consumed." The room seemed to darken even more with his words. I knew he was right. There was no other way out. If I didn't do this, the dark part of Hannah, that terrible thing trapped in the other doll, would be fully unleashed. Thomas began drawing a new circle on the floor, mixing ancient symbols with the faded ones already there. He lit more candles and placed Hannah's doll in the center of the circle. "You have to make the decision, Sarah," he said, without looking at me. "Only you can complete the ritual." I slowly approached the doll, her porcelain body looking harmless at first glance, but carrying the weight of a horrible story. Deep down, I knew I was connected to her in ways I couldn't explain. I had brought her here, and now everything depended on me. The air around me grew heavier, as if the very environment was trying to suffocate me. Thomas chanted the words of the ritual, his voice echoing through the walls of the house, but I knew he couldn't finish it alone. I looked at the doll with a lump in my throat. The decision I needed to make weighed on me like a stone. Hannah wanted to be freed, but at what cost? The house around us began to tremble slightly, as if something was about to happen. And then I heard a terrible sound, the creaking of wood, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I turned and saw, emerging from the shadows of the hallway, the second doll, the one with black eyes. She was moving on her own. "No," I whispered as the darkness of the second doll advanced toward us. Everything was about to unfold tragically. And now, the real fight was beginning. The Whitmore house was in complete chaos. The walls vibrated with dark energy, the floor groaned as if about to give way, and the second doll, with her black, empty eyes, moved faster and faster toward us. Thomas's voice was lost in the turmoil, reciting the words of the ritual, but now I knew something terrible was about to happen. The second doll, the darker spirit of Hannah, wouldn't allow the ritual to be completed. She wanted control of everything. My mind spun, fear and despair competing with the only certainty I had. Time was running out. The air was thick with the second doll's evil presence. Thomas shouted something I couldn't understand, but his urgency was clear. He was begging me to act, but my feet felt stuck to the floor, as if an invisible force was holding me down. I looked at Hannah's doll in the center of the circle. Her porcelain body glowed faintly, but her glass eyes remained fixed on me, silently pleading. I knew that inside that doll, a part of Hannah still longed for release. But the second doll, the corrupted version, was getting closer, moving like a living shadow, ready to destroy any hope of redemption. "Sarah," Thomas shouted again, his voice breaking through the rising noise of objects moving and walls creaking. "You need to finish it. It's the only way." My hands trembled, and I knew the decision lay before me. The only way to end this would be to sacrifice Hannah's doll. But the sacrifice wasn't just the doll. The ritual demanded something more, a soul sacrifice. And I knew, deep down, that meant sacrificing myself along with her. The second doll was nearly upon us, and the air around us seemed to twist with the evil presence emanating from her. Her energy was suffocating, heavy, and her intent was clear. If I hesitated, she would take everything. "Hannah?" I whispered, looking at the doll in the circle. The glow around her flickered, as if about to fade. I don't know what to do. But then, something happened. A soft voice, barely audible, emerged from the depths of my mind. It wasn't a voice of the corrupted Hannah, but the real Hannah, the girl trapped inside that doll for so long. "Free me," she whispered, her voice filled with pain and hope. "Please, Sarah, free me." My trembling hands held the porcelain doll. She was strangely warm, as if something alive pulsed inside her. Time seemed to slow as I looked at Hannah, at the doll in my hands. Deep down, I knew what had to be done. The second doll was about to strike, her evil presence spreading throughout the room. The energy around us seemed to build into a chaotic frenzy. Thomas continued chanting the words of the ritual, but his voice sounded distant, as if drowning in the darkness that surrounded us. I took a deep breath, and with all the strength left within me, I lifted Hannah's doll, preparing to throw her into the fire. "No!" The second doll screamed, her voice echoing through the room with overwhelming rage. She lunged toward me, her porcelain hand outstretched, but I knew I had to act quickly. "Free me," Hannah pleaded again, her voice now clearer, like an echo from the past. With a cry of desperation, I threw Hannah's doll into the fire. The flames roared with sudden fury, immediately consuming the doll. The circle around us began to glow intensely, and the oppressive energy that had surrounded us started to dissipate, sucked into the flames as if being purified. The second doll let out a piercing scream, an inhuman sound that reverberated through the walls of the house. She convulsed, her movements becoming erratic and desperate. The malevolent presence that had grown inside her began to falter, and I knew the ritual was working. The corrupted part of Hannah, that dark shadow her father had accidentally released, was being drawn back to where it had come from. For a moment, the entire room seemed to brighten. The fire in the fireplace roared loudly, as if it were burning not just the doll, but all the evil that had accumulated in that place. And then everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The second doll, now lifeless, had fallen to the floor, her black eyes empty and dead. The air around us felt lighter, as if the house had finally exhaled its last dark breath. Thomas stood beside me, still panting but relieved. "You did it," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the flames still consuming the remains of Hannah's doll. But as I looked at the fireplace, something inside me didn't feel right. The sense of relief I had expected never fully came. The fire burned silently now, but deep down, I knew something still remained. An echo, faint but unmistakable. The sound of a doll's cry. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Whatever I had freed, or perhaps whatever I had trapped, was still there, lurking. Hannah's fate was still shrouded in shadows. And perhaps mine was too. When I looked at Thomas, I saw in his eyes the same doubt gnawing at me. The ritual was complete, but the cost of freeing or destroying Hannah and everything that had been trapped inside her still hung over us like a threat. The fire continued to burn in the fireplace, but the disturbing echo of a doll's cry seemed to creep through the corners of the house, a grim reminder that evil rarely disappears completely. And then, everything went silent. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel and check out the next one playing on your screen.